start here. But if that doesn't work, that's okay. There's more interactivity next week, I think, if I can remember what I've done with my slides. So this is session number 5 in the preprint series. And today we're going to talk about preprint peer review. I appreciate you've also got pre-review. These are really hard words to say together. So you've got Daniela, or whoever it is, from pre-review also talking to you about preprint peer review. So I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and give you more of a broad overview of the peer review landscape rather than talking about any individual service or how to do or anything like that. I've also got some slides about where to share reviews for preprints, which again gives you a bit of a step back, kind of looking at the wider options available. So hopefully this will complement whatever it is Danielle has done or will do quite nicely. I've already done that bit. Next week, we are going to cover how to actually get involved with preprints and how to expand their visibility. I've actually just delivered that session with our fellows program last month. So that should be another good one. Daniel, is that a fresh hand?
No, it's not. I'm trying to lower it. Thank you.
Okay. So today we'll try a whiteboard activity. It may or may not work. We will go over the issues with the current ways of doing peer review. I think it's really important to talk about what's wrong with the system if we're going to talk about why preprint peer review is a good thing to do. I'll give you a bit of a history. This is a shorter version of a half-hour recording I've done previously on this, so that you've got a full thing to watch if you want to. And we'll cover the current landscape of preprint peer review and probably, almost certainly, have time for questions afterwards. So this is what the whiteboard will look like when I open it up. What you'll see are post-it notes down the left here. All you need to do is drag those into the relevant place. If you click on it, you can type and I'll clean it up afterwards. When this opens, this really is exactly what you'll see. I'm asking you to type out things you think that peer review does well, which is in the achieves, or not so well, so in the fails. Some things will overlap, and if I remember correctly, I think I have already got a couple of examples in there. So I'll start the whiteboard and we'll see if this works. Should have maybe started with this instead of starting with a presentation. That's the one. Okay, so you should see the whiteboard opening up soon. Okay, I can see it. So hopefully you can too. And you just need to drag them, drop them where you want them, and if you type away, you'll see it matches with the amount of typing you're doing. We'll give it a go. If it doesn't work for you, let me know, and we can skip it if it doesn't work for enough people. Okay, that's working for at least some of you, so that's good.
So because for me, it doesn't work to drag a sticky note from the notes that Jonny have on the right. You could also, you have like a toolbox on your left, and you can choose a sticky note from there to write on.
You can also right click on the screen and add sticky note. Or I think if you press N, that will also add a.
Ah, okay, that's great.
I've only just learned that. And just give this a few more minutes. But like I said, I will clean this up, so you can also just free text whatever you want on there, as long as it's in the right place, so I don't move anything. And this, of course, is a little bit of a trap, given that I'm about to tell you what's wrong with peer review. But I'm hoping we can get some things on here that you think peer review achieves, but actually it doesn't. And I think there's a lot of surprise for some people when we talk about the things everyone thinks it does, and it turns out it doesn't do it so well. Does do some things well. So lack of representation in the reviewer pool is a really big fail for peer review. And this actually is a thing that is largely unique to the journal peer review process. This is something preprint review does a really good job of getting around because we don't have as many restrictions on who can review and who can be a reviewer. And there's also people like Daniela who do amazing efforts to get a real global representation in the reviewer pool. All right, I'm going to give it 2 more minutes and then I will close the board. So on the point about providing expert feedback, I would agree with, it does. It can detect errors in methodology, however. I think is somewhere that point I would put in the middle. There's a really good study I'll talk about soon that actually looked at this and tested the ability of peer review to discover errors. All right, I'm going to close the whiteboard. Okay. So we have that, and I will clean that up and I'll share it with you afterwards, and we'll go back to sharing my slides. Okay. So we'll come back to that at the next session. I'll clean it up and we'll go through it. And it'll be interesting to see what you think has changed by the time you finish today's session based on what you wrote. So let's start with what the issues with current peer review practices are. And I've only got a couple of slides on this to show you, and we've got another little game where I'm going to force you to interact with me. But what I've been doing is I've been putting together different slide decks for various things. And one of those has been a slide deck about the issues with the current system. And there's so many issues with peer review that I decided to just put them all in one slide But really, we could break these down. Each one of these could be its own slide with a huge amount of data behind it. But what I've done here, based on the conversations we had in the earlier preprint sessions around peer review, is I think I may have shown you this slide in the earlier sessions, but this time I've updated it with a lot of evidence. And each of these points can be backed up with multiple bits of evidence. I've not cherry-picked here. I've just gone with good examples. There's way more we could put in here. But modern peer review, as you're about to find out, is not that old. It's a very, very recent experiment, and it is an experiment. It's important we think of it as that. As that whiteboard showed, one of the biggest issues with peer review, of course, is the bias that's involved. It's everything from gender, race, prestige, geography, right through to the Matthew effect. Reviewers consistently don't agree with each other when they do a peer review. Now, we all know this. If you've gotten peer review back for an article, you'll notice reviewer 1 might love it, reviewer 2 probably hates it, and reviewer 3 is a bit indifferent. That's not a great system when we're trying to protect the literature or say what is good or not good, depending on what you think peer review is meant to do. So if the reviewers don't agree on an article, how can anyone else agree on an article? Or why is that the gatekeeping barrier? We know that actually peer review does not detect fraud or protect the literature, and it's not designed to detect fraud. There's some really big examples over the past couple of years around this. I haven't put those ones in here yet because, as you can see, I ran out of space with all the references. But it's really important to highlight that it does not detect fraud. It's not designed to detect fraud. It never will in its current form. Peer review is also actually very bad at detecting errors and defects. And this is to my point with the whiteboard exercise again. Peer review does provide you with expert feedback, and that is good. It generally improves a manuscript. But reviewers are terrible at detecting errors in papers. And there were a few studies done to test this. And basically what they did was the authors deliberately sent manuscripts out for review that had errors in them. The authors had put deliberate errors in these manuscripts. And the experiment was to see whether or not the reviewers were able to detect those errors. And in the vast majority of cases, they didn't. And actually, there was quite a lot of reviewers who detected no errors whatsoever. So this really highlights the limits of peer review in its current form. It's also very slow and expensive. This is bad for our careers as researchers. It's bad for society because it limits the speed at which research gets out. And it shouldn't be as expensive as it is, given that we don't get paid to do it. So the money, the profits from this are actually all going to the journals and the shareholders of the journals. So again, it's not good for society. Peer review is hugely over-relied upon and often perceived as this stamp of approval when it comes to studies. And this leads to all kinds of misinformation, and it's quite a dangerous situation, I think. The best example, certainly in the UK, is the NMR vaccine. There was a peer-reviewed study that linked that vaccine to autism, and it did terrible things for vaccine uptake across the world, and still does, even though it's been retracted. The other thing is that actually, oh, that's my last point, but retractions are very slow. That paper took 10 years to be retracted. So for 10 years, it was out there with the seal of approval of peer review that it was good and it was reliable, and it wasn't at all. Peer review is also abused by some journals themselves. I'm going to give you an example of this, I think, in the next slide, and is also itself subject to fraud. There's some really interesting stuff come out today, or well, maybe yesterday, of a study looking into peer review fraud and how journals manipulate the impact factor system and peer review and all these other things. It's not a good system in its current form. And it's really difficult to convey this because despite all this evidence, it's how we're taught to do science. It's what we are taught is the right way to do. It's the best way of doing it. There's not a better alternative. And this is all rubbish. There are better alternatives. It's just people who have built their careers on this system don't want to change it. And it desperately needs changing. So I want to play a game. You can unmute or you can drop in the chat. Here are two papers published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS, which is a high-ranked journal. Can anybody spot the difference between these two papers? I'll give you a bit of time because it's really small. And drop it in the chat as soon as you think you've spotted the difference. Obviously not the title or author list. Would anybody like to take a guess which one of these was peer-reviewed, but the peer reviewers were chosen by the authors of the paper? So these are different papers. But one paper was peer-reviewed in the system we would normally expect. The other, it was peer-reviewed, but the reviewers were chosen by the authors of the paper. Do you know which is which? Does anyone want to take a guess which one was peer-reviewed in the normal way? I'm going to take the silence as you haven't figured out which one's which. So Samira has said the first one was peer-reviewed normally. Are you saying that because it's got reviewed by and then the names of the reviewers? Which is what my assumption would be. So this is the thing that's different. Edited by or contributed by? Okay, so it's the second person saying the first one was normal peer review process. Wrong. The first one was actually reviewed by the reviewers were chosen by the author. The second one was the normal peer review process. Now, obviously there is a difference in that the top one, the reviewers are named, the bottom one, they're not, which is, that's not great. I think the reviewers should be named on everything or nothing. It's weird to take this half approach. But the assumption you've all made there is exactly the point that I think is dangerous here, which is that because the reviews are named, you assume that this one has been the normal peer review process. But actually, it's this contributed by or edited by that you've got to look out for with PNAS. This top one was written by a Nobel Prize winner. This bottom one was not. This is the direct track, as they call it. So this is a normal submission. You send your manuscript to the editor. The editor decides if it goes out for review and who the reviewers are. This contributed track is unique to the proceedings journal. And what this is where select members, and they're almost always very, very big names, Nobel Prize winners, the kind of people you would not want to upset, they have the option of doing this contributed track, whereby they submit their manuscript, it's going to get published, and they choose who reviews that manuscript. Now, I shouldn't have to go into details as to why that is not a good system. And there's a lot of stuff out there. You can Google this and find loads of articles about people who they write a lot about how problematic this is. Additionally, over 40 scientists called for this top article to be retracted. The authors were not virologists, and it was pretty, it wasn't a very good study, let's just say. It was quite a lot of flaws in it, in its original version. I think the authors updated it in response to the call for retraction, but I might be wrong on that. And of course, by choosing the reviewers, you guarantee your work's going to get published because Melina here is the Nobel Prize winner. And there's a lot of those people in those kind of positions who don't take negative feedback very well. And especially if you were to invite junior members, for example, which I'm not saying is what happened here, but you can very easily see a situation whereby the reviewers are going to say whatever you want them to say. They're not going to give you an in-depth, thorough review of your work. So let's talk about predatory, quasi-predatory, and the Proceedings Journal. I talked last week about predatory publishers. We did a lot of this in the Q&A in the discussion. So I think this is a really good slide to add in here. There are a lot of well-known predatory journals, and these damage author reputations, they damage scholarship, scholarly communications. Terrible. There are also those journals which we call them quasi-predatory because they are legitimate journals, but they engage in predatory practices. And there's a link I can share afterwards around what determines predatory practices. These quasi-journals are things like Frontiers, MDPI, Hindawi, which has now been retired, although those journals still exist. They're just under a different name, which is, again, a reason not to trust the traditional publishers and putting money first in the way we do science. But so those are some examples. But then there's also this contributor track that I mentioned, and this is mostly unique to the Proceedings Journal, and it's where authors choose the reviewers. Now, this is only open to members, and as I've already said, these are usually big names, and it has a 98% acceptance rate compared to 18% for normal submissions to that journal. And in 2013, the top users were all men. There isn't a more up-to-date analysis of this. I will be surprised if that's changed much. It'll still almost certainly be overwhelmingly men, if not exclusively. And the other thing here is that those manuscripts submitted via this contributed track get reviewed a lot quicker. So you can see there's a two-tier system in reviewing at this journal. And as I've shown you on the last slide, it's really difficult to know exactly which one's which for the average reader. And I would say this is highly suspicious, and you really probably shouldn't trust something that's gone. Anything with 98% accept rate, you probably shouldn't trust so much. And this really draws on how journals can manipulate peer review to benefit themselves and their selected authors. And this should get you all very, very angry. It gets me very angry. There's a bunch of links there. You can read more about this if you want to. So that's what's current. It's an overview of what's currently wrong with the system. From the top of my head, I couldn't tell you which other journals have it. I just know PNAS are not the only one. They're the biggest one, though, with this kind of system. So let's give you a quick overview of the history of peer review, because this is something that, again, there's a lot of misconceptions around this, because nobody gets taught the history of this. If you do want to watch the full half-hour version of me talking about the history, you can do that here. I'm going to give you the quick version. Okay, so when did peer review actually start? Most people will tell you peer review has been around for about 350 years and is a well-established gold standard way of doing things. There's not a better way of doing it. Those people are wrong. They're horribly, horribly wrong. Peer review actually has its very original origins right back in the 5th century BC. And this is what I call prehistorical or prehistory peer review. This is in Syria, I believe, is where it originally started. And then you've got the ancient Greeks as well getting involved. It's not peer review as we would think of it. But if you wanted to trace it back to the very beginning, the very seeds of it, that's how far back you have to go. And then we get into what most people refer to as the real history of peer review, which happened around the 17th century. And the most common name you'll come across here is Henry Oldenburg. You'll also probably come across the Medical Essays and Observations Journal. And then William Whewell is a name I think we should all know because it's an interesting aspect of this study. However, peer review in the way we use it now, in the way we would consider what peer review is, didn't start until around the 1970s. So there are some big journals who did not have peer review until after the 1970s. Nature, for example, didn't start doing peer review until the 1970s. I think it might be 1975. Might be off on that. And then in around 2017, we have preprint peer review beginning to appear. So how did modern peer review start? I said Henry Oldenburg is the name most people will be familiar with. And he was the secretary for the Royal Society in the UK. And he was in charge of the journal they had at the time. But this is not peer review because Oldenburg used his own judgment in the selecting process. He did not use external opinions. He had no referee system, didn't ask other people. That's not peer review in the way we think of it now. If you think it is, then I would also kind of agree with you, just to make it confusing. Because everyone who reads a paper, whether it's been published or not, is reviewing that paper. You should read things critically. Now, we could do that as a system of publishing. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. But usually people are referring to this as peer review in the way we do it now, and that's not what Henry Oldenburg
Madam, your leg go.
Is that a question? No. Okay. So Henry Oldenburg did not start peer review. The other thing that you will come across is the Medical Essays and Observations Journal. This was by the Royal Society in Edinburgh in the 1730s. In this case, they sent memoirs out by correspondence and distributed according to subject matter to people who would be interested. This was not peer review again. These were already published things that were being sent around for one. But they weren't getting peer review reports back either. So still not peer review, but also something that people who think they know the history of peer review will tell you is where peer review started. And then I said, William Whewell should be a name we all know, because he's quite interesting. So this is a bit later, this is in 1831. And he said, he didn't really do much, but he said that peer review reports were really important because these were things that would be written by teams of eminent scholars, and these reports might actually be more interesting than the actual scientific study, and therefore a great source of publicity for science. The reason I like throwing William in here is that this kind of sums up what eLife are now doing and how they approach peer review, and also puts peer review in a much more important place, because now it's about the quality. It's a real sell for the work that's being reviewed, and it's a different way of thinking about it. Again, though, it's not peer review in the way you think about it. So if this is not modern peer review, what is? Well, I said it started largely in the 1970s. And I just put some quotes here for famous examples where people didn't like peer review. So Einstein very famously submitted a manuscript to an editor who sent it out for peer review, and he did not like that. He actually pulled the paper from the journal because he saw no reason to address the comments of an anonymous expert. And so he published the paper elsewhere. The famous DNA double helix paper was not peer reviewed. In fact, Watson, this is a quote from Watson, the reason that manuscript was sent to Nature is that at the time, Nature was a place where you got very rapid publication. And so a week after they had this paper, the first drafts were out in Nature, which anybody submitting to Nature now, you're not going to get that experience, even if you are a Nobel Prize winner. That's because there was no peer review in place. So Nature could just, if the editor liked it, it would be in the journal. And then Max Perutz, who is a Nobel Prize winning biologist, he had this to say about peer review, which is all papers sent to Nature are checked by members of the board, and therefore peer review is unnecessary. And this is how peer review started. Remember, this is 1960s, 1970s. This is not that long ago. So we've already got a lot of people not supportive of peer review at the very beginning when it started. But why did it start? Why do we have the system we have? To answer that question, we actually have to go back to the US and look at the politics that were happening at the time. There were 3 congressmen in the US at the time, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. Can't remember which way that's split. I think that guy was a Republican. Might be wrong. Doesn't matter. And basically, they were not happy with the National Science Foundation because they thought the National Science Foundation was awarding grants to wasteful and frivolous projects. And that's the words they used to describe it. So what happened was there was a showdown between basically between Congress and the NSF. And you can go and find all the documentation around all of this as well. The NSF argued that by conducting peer review, they did not need congressional oversight. whereas the congressional members here wanted much greater oversight as to how NSF was spending its budget, what kind of projects were being funded. Now, both of those, I think, were a bit of a losing situation. I don't think it was a way of winning this argument, but NSF effectively won the argument because Congress backed off and we ended up with the peer review system we have today. Now, I said that was about grants, it was, but it very much leaked out to individual research papers and publishing, and it spread obviously much broader than just the US. But this is a fundamental point in modern current peer review practices. It really does very much get traced back to this point. If you want more on that, like I said, go watch that half-hour video that I did. And this all leads me to the question of what the purpose of peer review is. Everyone seems to have different answers to this. So I'm going to give you what I think it is based on historical points. So originally, it was to promote scientific outputs and to aid with editorial decisions. That's getting back to that quote I gave you from William Whewell, for example. It mutated into what we have now, which is it's actually more about improving a paper and measuring perceived impact and what is good science, however you might define that. And this is horribly wrong. This is not what peer review should be. What I think peer review should be is a very simple question. Are the conclusions supported by the data and citations within the paper? Now, this includes, have the authors overblown their conclusions? Are they selling something they haven't actually proven? Tampering things down usually is what peer review is pretty good at doing. But if we stick to that simple question, now we're not asking people to spend tens of thousands of dollars on another year-long experiment or asking them to do stuff that would really be the next paper, the next step. All we're doing now is saying, is this paper in its current form with all the things that have gone with that, so the data with it, the conclusions, the writings, the citations, does this make sense? Is it appropriate? If it is, it should be published. And if it's not, then do we need to do more experiments or do we just need to change the writing? In about 90% of the cases, you just need to change the writing. You tone down your conclusions a little bit. You add more limitation statements in so that you're presenting data that's qualified. There's nothing wrong with doing a study where you've done something from a particular angle. If you then explain, well, these are all the other angles and other things that could explain what we found, but we didn't do it. We couldn't do it, whatever the reason might be. Because then you've qualified your data. You said, here are our very clear limitations. And so your conclusions are correct within that context. And that really helps readers who aren't familiar with your field either. So I'm big fan of limitation statements in papers and preprints. So what's the current landscape of preprint peer review? Well, this is growing every day. I said it started around 2017. You can see there was a very small number during 2016. And it really does, it's growing month on month. The most recent data, as reliable data, would be before June, around here. This is data from Society, so there's going to be things missing from here. But this is really great to see. This is definitely an increasing space. The downside here, the negative part of this, is this represents about 2% or so of the preprints that exist in bioscience. This is all bioscience. So about 10%, well, 12% of the biomedical literature is pre-printed, and then about 2% of that is actually peer-reviewed. So it's still a very, very small number, but this is also an area where we're not just seeing growth in the people doing reviews of preprints, but also the infrastructure around how to review a preprint, where you can go to poster reviews. This is all exploding, and it's a really exciting space to be in at the moment. Recognition for preprint peer review is also on the increase. So we've got doctoral schools that are recommending preprints that have been peer-reviewed to be the same value as an article in a journal. We've got ORCID and pre-review having this recognition, so you can have your ORCID profile can reflect the fact that you've been peer-reviewing preprints. Indexes like EuropePMC have the peer reviews presented very prominently alongside the preprint in the article. This is an example from my work. And then places like bioRxiv have the toolbar, which again, very prominently highlights peer review. So you've got the first three here are all about peer review in different vibes. So you've got comments, you've got official peer reviews, you've got community peer reviews. These are all efforts collectively that are designed to highlight the importance of peer review, but also doing it better and doing it more robustly. The other thing we're seeing is a lot of policy changes around preprints, but particularly peer-reviewed preprints. So in 2022, EMBO announced that any reviewed preprint would fulfill the eligibility criteria for their postdoctoral fellowships. Plan S, of course, is very supportive of peer-reviewed preprints, and they state that these should be considered the equivalent of a peer-reviewed publication. So you can see we're already starting to remove the need for a journal if you have a preprint, it's peer-reviewed. And then most recently, in this year, taking effect in January, the Gates Foundation announced that they would be mandating preprints and strongly encouraging preprint peer review for all their grantees. And of course, they will also no longer be paying the APCs. This is in the context of also a lot of other funders and institutions who support preprints and preprint peer review, but have not yet mandated it. So how do you choose a platform to post your review? ASAPbio, a little while ago, put together these features of a preprint review platform that you can look at to get an idea. You can read more here. I'm not going to focus on this at the moment because we have this slide instead, which gives you a bit more direction into where you can share your reviews. So you can leave them as a comment. You can write traditional reviews. You can use really good tools that do inline commenting in the web browser. You can also do it as part of a journal club. And actually, while I'm on it, if you do it as part of a journal club, we are currently funding the conversion of journal clubs into preprint review clubs. But even if we can't fund it, you should still do it because there's so many benefits to doing that. And I haven't linked it here, but I did write an article recently about the benefits from reviewing preprints in your journal club. And there are now over 35 different platforms you can use to share your preprint review. Never discount social media posts. There are some brilliant actual in-depth reviews posted on places like Twitter. You wouldn't think it, but they are there. And sometimes you can see threads where it's a back and forth with the actual authors of the work as well. And you end up with a really cool public collaboration going on. Commenting on preprint servers is very low, but this is a really good place to post a review because it's directly linked with the preprint, and usually the version of the preprint as well, depending on the server. If you're doing community-based reviews, so maybe this is the journal clubs or as a virtual group or an in-person group, or even if you just want to do it yourself, pre-review is a really good platform to then post those reviews to. The other benefit of pre-review is that you can do this anonymously if you wanted to. And then the place I recommend everyone get started is Prelights. Prelights is not a preprint review platform as such. It's a highlighting service. So this is really good because you don't review work, but you write a news and views highlighting type article about a preprint that you find interesting. And then you can ask the authors questions, and there's a little bit of reviewing in there, but not much. So Prelights is a really great first step, first introduction to getting more involved in this world, which we'll talk about more next week. When you do review a preprint, we've also devised these fast principles for how to do that. And again, this is all linked out, so I'm not going to focus on this. But the idea is you provide focused, appropriate, specific, and transparent feedback. I always think you should sign your peer reviews. I think it's wrong to hide that because people need to know who you are and what your background is. There are dangers to doing that, and so I understand why people don't do it. But I think it would be a better if we had a system where we did do it. And also it helps us recognize the review activity. We also very recently designed a guide on how to review a preprint. This equally applies to any review you're doing. This can be printed off, or there's a digital version, which is actually interactive. So how do you get involved with preprint peer review? If you want to do it with us, you can do. So ASAPbio this month launched the 4th version of our crowd preprint review. This is going to run for 1 year, and the first preprints actually went out last week. The way this works is it's a virtual crowd. We send you a preprint. You have 2 weeks to comment on it in Google. And then we close the commenting. person who sent you the preprint will synthesize those into what looks like a normal peer review, and then we upload that to pre-review and done. The next month we send you another new preprint and you do it again. We're recognizing this activity this year with digital badges. So if you do 5 reviews, you get a badge and a certificate for doing that. And we do that right up to 20 reviews. We've only got one person so far who's actually managed to do 15 reviews. That was from last year's program. And this year we've got 4 crowds. So we've got cell biology, immunology, microbiology, and meta research. And again, there's a link here if you want to learn more. We also have these resources that I present to you that are linked out. They're on Zenodo. You can find them very easily. And you're free to download, print, use however you want. We encourage you to print, use however you want. And with that, I've ended with enough time for a bit of a Q&A if anyone has any questions.
Well, thank you, Jonny, very much. I think the first question would it be, could you tell us a bit more about the crowd preprint review that ASAPbio is doing? Just more information on how to get involved and how does it work?
So the easiest way of finding anything from ASAPbio is Google, because we need to update our website. So if you Google ASAPbio crowd preprint review, you'll find it on our website. There's a link to sign up there. You can join all 4 crowds. You can join 1 crowd, 2 crowds, whatever you want. And like I said, the way it works is you are part of this virtual crowd. You will receive an email at the beginning of each month. Obviously, if you're in all 4 crowds, you will receive 4 emails at the beginning of the month. And each month you will have a new preprint. It's a fresh preprint, so it shouldn't have been reviewed yet by anyone. And as a crowd, you review that preprint. That means you can comment on a single figure or a single panel of a figure if that is your expertise. If you can also comment on the whole thing, great. If not, it doesn't matter. The benefit of a crowd is that lots of people do this on a preprint, and then we collate those reviews together into one, and that's the thing that's shared. We don't share the individual comments. The benefit of doing it this way is that if you've never done a review before, you can firstly see what other people are commenting and how they're doing it. But also it means you really can, if you can only comment on one bit, you can still do it and you've still done a review. So it's a nice way into it. It's done all asynchronously. So it's a Google Doc that we send around with the preprint in it. And you just comment as you would on any Google document inline. There's also a template at the top so you can fill it out if you want to. But it's a nice gentle way in. It's not paid or anything like that because we just can't afford it. We have 100 or so members in each crowd. The benefit of this system is that usually we end up with 4 to 6 people reviewing a preprint instead of the journal system where 2 or 3 people review a paper. So there's a lot more eyes on it. And like I said, you can get into the thing you're very much an expert on and then ignore the rest of it if you wanted to.
And for example, you said that now you have crowds about immunology, meta research, and so on. So do I have to be an expert, like, for example, have a PhD degree on that topic, or is it like just...
No, you can join as you wish. You don't have to have a PhD. There's no qualifications. You don't have to work at a research institution. If you might get a preprint, for example, where it's not your field at all, you can't comment on it. That's also fine. We don't ask you to comment on every single preprint. If you join the cell biology crowd, as an example, the expectation is you will have some cell biology knowledge. Hopefully, you will get a preprint that matches that knowledge and you can use it and comment and do a review. It doesn't always happen because, like I said, we've got a lot of people in the crowd. It's hard to pick a preprint everyone can comment on. But as long as you think you could provide some expertise to that crowd, feel free to apply and join. I mean, apply. Feel free to join. You fill the format and I copy you into the relevant place. There's no application.
Actually, I don't know. Maybe first I'll ask anyone if they have a question before I comment. Yeah, Musa says that this should be included in graduate level education curriculum. Yeah, you're absolutely right. All of the open science. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so if there are not any questions, so maybe I could comment, is that I feel like one of the sort of takes away that people could have against open peer review is that uh, uh, they could say that everyone could do the peer review. They're not experts, so how could you trust the review? Like, isn't this something that comes up?
I mean, yeah, it's kind of the same argument with preprints, right? Anyone can post a preprint, so how do you trust it? Again, so the difference actually here is, yes, anyone could review a preprint or a paper. The same is also true with journals. Obviously, when we think of peer review with journals, we're thinking of the big journals where it is generally done properly, but don't forget all those predatory publishers or the PNAS track where you have no idea if the peer review has been done properly or not. The benefit of of doing it openly is that firstly, the peer review report is open. So it doesn't matter if you're a PhD, well, maybe you're not, maybe you're a first year PhD student. In the traditional peer review process, you would never be allowed to do a review. You would not be deemed an expert. But if you spent a year doing the same lab technique over and over, you are absolutely an expert on that technique. With open peer review, people can see what you've said. So other people can use their judgment as well to see if it was a sensible comment or not, which is a big benefit. The other thing is that open peer review allows much more of a dialogue and a conversation. So if there is a problematic reviewer, it's very clear, very quickly, very clear. And the community generally will react against that. There are, again, not on the top of my head, but there are examples of where that has happened. The other thing is it brings it all into the open, right? So you can't hide behind anything. You can't have these really inappropriate peer review practices because everyone can see it. So yes, anybody could review a preprint, but I wouldn't view that as a danger. I think the dangerous situation is the situation we have now where that is still true, but it's all behind closed doors, it's all hidden. You have no way of knowing if the peer review was done appropriately or not. Again, that doesn't help anyone outside of that field, but it does give an indication. But I also don't know anyone who would waste their time doing a review for something they can't actually review.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Musa, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for a very useful session. And the question I have is there any method to detect fraud or similar activity during peer review, or just we are blind for this kind of activities, fraud and similar activity? You have mentioned that we cannot detect fraud during peer review. So how can we detect fraud? That's the question I have.
It's a question everyone's asking. It's a really difficult thing to do, right? Because if you're good at committing fraud, you're likely to get away with it. Doesn't matter whether it's academic or just out there committing crimes kind of fraud. It's really hard to detect during peer review. It's basically almost impossible to detect during peer review. The ways around it are the same things I've been saying throughout this whole series, which is openness and transparency. So the biggest example I can think of recently, the Surgosphere scandal. So bunch of papers published in very, very big journals. And it turns out the data had all been completely fabricated. Peer reviewers couldn't detect that. Because how would a peer reviewer know if your data has been fabricated? It's not always an easy thing to spot. And it was discovered afterwards, after it was all published, that there were issues with the data. And this is where sites like PubPeer are really, really good. And then there was a long process between the authors and between the journal, and eventually this stuff has been retracted. And it was basically one author who created a data set that everyone else had used. So even the authors in that case weren't even necessarily to blame. It was just one author. we can't tackle anything if we can't see the underlying things. This is why every paper needs the data to be fully available and accessible, not just to the reviewers, but to everyone afterwards, so that you can do post-publication peer review as well, which is what preprint peer review is. And that's much better because you have a much wider number of people looking at it. And so it is essential we have open data, open peer review reports. Everything that can be open and transparent should be, not just because it's good for science and good for all of us, but also because taxpayers are still paying for all of this. So it should be open for that reason as well. And peer review reports can be very useful for training purposes, but also for actually seeing how a paper evolved and changed. Often you can read a paper and you can kind of pick out what the reviewers have asked for based on just the figures, because you'll be reading it and then there'll suddenly be a figure that just doesn't really quite fit. And that's almost certainly the reviewers have asked for this. But other times you need the peer review report to see how things changed. And I'm not pretending that people read peer review reports. For the most part, they don't. Another really good example where this was protective, you'll have all almost certainly been aware last year, or this year? Maybe last year, maybe the start of this year. It's been a long time. There was the Homo neandai paper. It was published on eLife, and it was very problematic. Basically, it was published because the authors had a Netflix series coming out that they needed a paper for. And the peer review took center stage there. And it was because the peer review was open and transparent that everyone in the community knew this was a problematic paper. It was the first review eLife had done since the switch in model. That was a negative review. Nobody else would have known that if we hadn't had the peer review open and available. So that was a long way of saying transparency is the only real solution to any of this. There are tools and things coming up that detect some of these things, but ultimately transparency is the answer.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much.
So we have 2 more minutes to go. Does anyone else have a question or a comment? Yeah, and to agree with you, Jonny, this is what I wrote in the comment. This is why open data is important. I think it's a system, like open science is a system that works like hand in hand, you know, each part of it augment the other parts.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
science should be open in every sense of the word. And as like just to come back to Musa's point about this should all be part of your general curriculum. It absolutely should. We should be taught all of this. This to me is part of being open by talking about the things that are wrong and the data behind it and how we can do things differently, or maybe just let's try and experiment doing something differently. It's just about being open. And the other thing is when we talk about posting preprints, and we'll talk about this more next week, if you're going to do it, do it. Lead by example. I'm open about everything. It makes my life a misery sometimes, but it means everyone knows that I really stand by what I'm currently arguing for and pushing for. You know for certain I will never take a job with Springer Nature or Elsevier, as much as they'd probably pay me really nicely. So take the elements you want to see and put them into practice. It's the best way of changing the system.
And I think also what could work if we also have open methodology. If you have a paper that has open data and open methodology, I think it would be much easier to detect if this is fraudulent or if this is true. So having all aspects of the research open, as Jonny said, transparency, I think is the answer indeed. So I think we're just on time, but I just have one more question, Jonny. We always say that peer review is expensive, even though the reviewers are not paid. So where does this expensive come from?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? So there's a few places that money goes to. One are the editorial staff, that the time involvement of finding peer reviewers. Some of it goes to the infrastructure. So there's like the editorial manager systems that when you upload your manuscript, you have to deal with every single time. It's staff costs. It's those kind of costs where I would argue they're not necessary because we could do this as a community for free. There's always going to be infrastructure costs, and certain infrastructures you can look at and you can actually work out how much it costs per review because they were very open about all of that. But besides the infrastructure costs, which are relatively low, there's no reason to have a lot of costs on top of that. And it's just to give you a number, it's something like was it 4 billion or something per year that we spend on peer review?
And not on the actual peer review, actually, and the things around it, just like the decorations around it.
Yeah, I mean
that's interesting.
That number does also factor in like the wasted cost of reagents and time, I think, for doing some of the reviews, which is the other cost as well. So we pay for peer review, but we also then have to pay money to do all the experiments that peer reviewers want, which are not always essential to publishing your paper.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was always wondering, like we say expensive, but if you're not paying the reviewers, then why is it expensive? So that's a nice answer.
Shareholders.
Yeah.
Way of making money.
Business. Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah. Well, I don't know if anyone else has a question or comment. If not, I think we could say thank you to Jonny for this wonderful and stimulating session. And we're really looking forward to next week's session. Thank you very much, Jonny. And thank you guys for attending.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Au revoir.
Au revoir, Zoe.